Hello, I'm Tracy Nicholas, and welcome to Folkloring. I am a passionate folklore practitioner, and to me, folkloring is more than just a podcast. It's my commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Folkloring. And today I'm here with Joanna Tarnawska, and she is an animist, a folk practitioner, an author, and a psychologist based in the mountains of Lower Silesia, Poland. Her approach is rooted in and informed by living bioregional traditions and folklore, historical craft of the early modern period, as well as anthropological and ethnographic studies of pre and post Christian traditions of the West Slavs. She is the author of Polish Folk Magic, Ancestral Lore and Traditions of the West Slavs from Crosscrow Books, and Polish Folk Witch is Joanna's ongoing online community project aimed at educating the Slavic diaspora, promoting Polish culture, teaching courses, and facilitating group studies on a broad variety of subjects pertaining to Polish folk magic, animism, and traditional folkloric witchcraft. So, Joanna, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to be here today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to be here.
So we're going to talk about your book. Very excited to see that coming out. But before we start, let me ask you, have you been folkloring lately? And if so, how?
Oh, yes, my entire life is folkloring, actually. But what I've been doing lately and focusing on it a lot is practicing traditional Polish folk songs with my local folk singing group that I belong to, because we are practicing for an upcoming show for the summer solstice local festivities that we call Targi Budkowe. So that's been very exciting. And I guess with singing traditional folk songs that are local to where you are, it can't really get more folkloring than that, can it?
That's true. That's very true. As for me, I want to say that I've been out gathering the mulberries in the yard, but sadly, it has been very cold here and they're not yet ripe, which is bumming me out because I'm going to be traveling next week and I think they're going to get ripe then. So I'm going to miss my perfect window of opportunity. But I went to a full moon ritual last week, and I am going to a solstice ritual this week. I think that definitely is going to be most of the time I have for folkloring right now.
That sounds lovely, really.
Yeah, it's a great group of people that I go to ritual with, and we all really like each other, and we hang out afterwards, and just talk, and it's really an interesting group of people, and I love them all very much. Okay, so let's talk about you and your book. Can you start us off by telling us about yourself and about the path that got you to where you are now and all of the folklore stuff that you are involved in?
Sure. So, as you were mentioning in the introduction, which I am very thankful for, I am an animist. I also practice folk magic and traditional witchcraft. So, I grew up in rural Poland in a very tiny village where legends of local spirits and all the folklore stuff has been very, very present. So I've been exposed to that from a young age. And also my family come from generations of farmers. So I grew up with a lot of respect for the land. My
Mhm.
grandmas taught me about foraging herbs and plants and tending to the land and the animals from a very young age as well. So that's kind of always been part of my life growing up. When it comes to the witchcraft and folk magic parts, I have been a practitioner for almost 20 years at this point. So it's been a while that I've been on this path. And 5 years ago, really, I decided to start sharing and teaching what I know with others via Patreon, especially, and via social media. And from that teaching is kind of how this idea for my book also came, because I noticed that there's so many people who are interested in our traditions and there's so little access to, this information firsthand. So that's kind of where I arrived at where I am today.
Nice. That's really interesting that you grew up with it because it's so different than my experience of we would never have talked about that. I mean, we barely like we celebrated Christmas and Easter, but other than that, it wasn't really anything that was even thought about in my family. I mean, I got interested when I was in high school, but it's just not a normal thing around here. You know, people have religion, but they don't, there's just not much folklore where I've come from. It came to me a little bit later in life, and I'd always been interested, but I think that I would have loved to have had your experience just growing up sort of in an area steeped in folklore.
hmm You know what? I think that we take it for granted
Mhm.
here
Mhm.
because it's just so embedded in the culture and everything we do and the kind of, seasonal traditions, especially. And Poland is very Catholic by itself. So it's not like everybody here is a folk practitioner. It's not like that, really. All of it is kind of covert when it comes to the folk magic part, but the folklore is present and it's even more embedded in the Catholic lore, I would say, especially in the rural places in Poland. So growing up with that, it's not like you realize, this is folklore and this is all this ancestral wisdom that is being passed on to you. It's kind of just what you live with, I suppose. And then later on, as you grow up, and if you really are into it, as I just so happen to always be, you understand the worth that it has, the impact that it has, and also comparing, the experience with folks of the diaspora. This is what I hear about a lot, actually. That people say like they wish that their grandparents would pass down the lore to them or teach them about the traditions, or maybe even like teach them a tiny bit of the language. But a lot of the times it just seems like the older generations who migrated to the US, for example, like weren't really that keen on sharing any of that because they just wanted to make sure that their family assimilates as much as possible so that everybody can kind of be accepted as a local. So I totally understand where this is coming from and why not much of those folkloric traditions were like passed down in migrant families, right? It kind of makes sense on a cultural level and just survival level, really. So
Right.
it's really fascinating.
It's interesting being in Chicago, and Chicago is a very segregated city. You know, there are neighborhoods, there's a Polish neighborhood, and it's a big community here. And so people want to assimilate, and yet they also have a great deal of pride in cultural heritage and their Polish background. So I wonder if it's somewhat different here and people do have a little bit more of that experience from the older generations. I'd be very interested in that to find that out. Because certainly there are like centers where it's, you know, Polish history and all of that, and stores that are specifically like imported Polish food and things like that. So I wonder if it's a little bit better here, but I don't know.
You know what? From what I'm hearing, at least, but I'm an outsider, obviously, right? So I don't have as much of an inside perspective, but still, it seems like Chicago is one of those areas where there's a very prominent Polish community in general. So the Polish people in general, it just seems like when we migrate, we like to accumulate in like spots where you can still see familiar faces and hear the familiar language and so on. So it does seem like Chicago, maybe because of this accumulation of the Polish people in one place, might be better off with like access to the culture and the food and all of that and cultivating those traditions still than other areas where maybe people aren't as, there's no strength in numbers, basically, right? But it could be interesting. I don't know if there's like any type of research maybe around this. I have no idea, but it could be cool to see how it differs between different regions.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to do a little research. The only thing that I really know about any of the history is that there's an area in Chicago called Bucktown. And it was called that because a lot of Polish immigrants came here and they moved into that area. And culturally, it was a lot more acceptable for them to, like, each family to personally, like, own a goat, right? And
Hmm
slang for goat was buck. And so there were a lot of goats in the area. And so that's why they eventually named it Bucktown. Now that
Oh,
is
I love that.
Yeah, that is not the current area where there's a concentration of Polish people. It's more of like an artist community now, but it's still called the same. And that was the history that I knew about it. And of course, we have, a lot of history with goats here and our Cubs team. So, but that's another story. I want to talk about your stories. So tell us a little bit about the book that you have, when it's coming out, and what readers will find in it.
So Polish folk magic is coming out in December of this year. So we are still waiting very impatiently, by the way, for it to come out. But ultimately, I would say that this book is my gift from the heart to the Slavic diaspora and everybody who considers themselves an enthusiast of the Slavic culture worldwide. It is an introductory guide into the folk beliefs, the seasonal practices, the living ancestral traditions, and of course, the authentic folk magic of my people. This is mostly centered around Polish lore and Polish folk magic, but some of the contents, obviously, because Poland is within the group of West Slavs, some of it would also be very similar to that which you find in the Czech Republic or in Slovakia, for example. There is some overlap. So with this book, I really want to make sure that the reader who maybe doesn't have firsthand access to our culture and our traditions gets this introduction into the Polish folkloric and mythic perception of the world. So explaining the cultural and regional folk magic, how our ancestors understood the ontology, how the world was created, how it is structured, the type of spirits that we recognize and that were always very present in the lives of our ancestors, the most important parts of cult of certain spirits or maybe natural phenomena. The most important part is explaining Polish folk magic, both in theory and in practice. So I want to make sure that people understand how folk magic works,
Mhm.
how Polish folk magic is specifically maybe built on top of the foundation of folk magic that you would recognize anywhere, but also the rules that are about all of the practices that are very regional, like zamawiania, spoken formulas. So I want to ensure that everybody has this foundation of understanding the rules that are specific to Polish folk magic, which is of course rooted in lore, but also the folk magic in practice, the traditional zamawiania, spoken formulas, how they work, how they are created in Poland, all of the curses and evil eye, all of the protection magic, the types of traditional amulets and talismans, even egg magic or love magic that's present in Poland. That has been very important for me to gather all of the, juicy historical formulas and put them in one place because there's never been a book that gathers all of that stuff together for people who are practitioners who could actually use that in their practice. I also made it a point to explain, all of the most important spirits and allies that we work with in Polish folk magic and generally that our ancestors would interact with and recognize on a daily basis. And lastly, a big chunk of the book are the agrarian traditions and basically the Polish folkloric year. So I go season by season through each month and explain everything you need to know about all of the seasonal traditions, the lore of them, the magic that was done during each time of year,
Mhm.
the feast days of saints that are very much rooted in the agrarian tradition, and just gathering all of it in one place, basically, for somebody to be able to read this one book and have a very, very solid foundation in what Polish folk magic is and the kind of folklore around it.
This is so exciting. I'm so looking forward to this book now because you see so many books that are just like, here's a spell. Here's what this means. Here's what that means. And I love the fact that you go into the history and the philosophy and the specifically Polish folklore wheel of the year kind of thing and what comes up in each month and how it fits in with the cycles of the land. Because I think that again, being here, having a large Polish community, I've noticed that when people do move, they bring their traditions with them, but then they also incorporate the land around them, what's available to them. There, maybe it's different foods, or maybe it's, different herbs. So I think that it's so fascinating to be able to take a look into the folklore from the perspective of someone who has been steeped in the original land and culture and the land spirits and the nature around you. And to be able to get it from that perspective is great because we don't always get that. And I think it's great if people are incorporating what's around them. That's great too. And that's, important to look how those things change over time. But it's especially, like, as you said, there aren't a lot of books about Polish folk magic and folklore. And so to be able to really hear that in context is so exciting to me. I can't tell you.
I'm so excited that you are excited, honestly. And I so agree with you that I often also see things included in books about like specific spell, but not really explaining where it came from, the context of it, and all of that. I think that cultural context is very important. But also, what you were talking about with folks in the diaspora taking pieces of the culture, but also when you move, that tradition, that lore, and all of it evolves with the land around you. And I think it's very important to stress that it should be this way. We can't just keep something in a very sterile form and never changing form, because that's not alive. That's a dead tradition. We need to be incorporating that into the ecology around us, into the land around us. And I also stress that throughout the book, that look, this is the foundation, but you need to apply it to the land where you are. That's very, very important. And I see a lot of the times also wanted to mention it here because I encountered this with the folks from the diaspora, that there's a lot of this imposter syndrome almost about the fact that the culture evolved with the diaspora and feeling like it's not, as legit as the things we have here. I disagree. I think it's just as legit, it's just as important, and just as authentic, because culture always evolves, folklore evolves. It's all a living tradition. It's very, very important for people to really grasp that, because we don't want something that's just repeated from a book without any context, without any thought, any heart in it. It needs to be alive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that goes back to what you were saying about people trying to incorporate themselves into the culture that they end up in. And you do see that the people that are most successful, I think, in moving to a different place are the people that, they take on the language and they take on sort of the culture around them. And people who don't and they just like, I'm gonna speak, whatever it is, if it's Spanish or Polish or whatever, and they're isolated then. And that is, I think, important in a folkloric sense too, because we all have our own like family folklore, right? And our stories, and telling those stories is not only telling the cultural stories, but telling the family stories. Like traveling, going and living in a different country is a huge story. And if your family then stays there, that is a completely different experience that if that first person hadn't have had the courage to make a change and go move. And so I think that it's a balance between keeping that heritage, but saying it's going to evolve now because I've evolved and I've gone and done something that the rest of my family has not. It's interesting, very, very interesting stuff.
I agree. I think it should be something that we are proud of and not something that we hide.
Well, and it's always a weird balance for me being American because we don't say I'm an American. It's always like I'll say, "Oh yeah, my father's family was Greek and my mom was, Scottish and English." And like we identify that way, but then we're kind of shamed for it. It's like you're not Greek, you're American, right? And it's like, yeah, but this is what my roots are. And so Americans are really proud of their roots, but then sort of people are like, no, you're not. So it can be hard.
Yeah, I think not everybody understands that kind of multicultural experience of having roots from different places at the same time, and that being very important to you as part of your identity and part of being proud of who you are and who your ancestors were. I think that sometimes locals don't understand that because they just don't have that kind of experience. And I always try to explain to people who are local to me that, as for example, us in Poland, the people here experienced so much displacement through wars, through this and that, through changes of borders and so on. None of us can, like, okay, barely anyone can say that their ancestors were living in this one spot for 1,000 years. Most of us are just from all over the place. We migrate, it's okay. And we build our experience and our identity on both who our ancestors were and where they came from, but also where we live today. And I think not everybody grasps that here in Europe. So it's sometimes something that needs to be like explained so that
Right.
people get it and can sympathize with that. I really sympathize with it. That it's important for people to carry on this legacy and to identify with where their ancestors came from. So totally get it. And I think, as I was saying, it's something that should be celebrated.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's nice to hear that you're going to be sharing traditions because I think that so many people get their folklore from Hollywood movies and they don't really understand what the real folklore was. And like, I'm not going to say real folklore as in there's a definitive folklore because it's always changing. As you said, it's a living thing, right? It's growing and changing. You said you grew up in a very rural area. That's going to be a different lifestyle than if you move to a city or even a town, right? It's different. And so I think that it's really exciting to be able to hear what some of the like not authority folklore because we get so much of that. And I think that so many people think that movie like the entire like multiverse of different superheroes is where the folklore it might have been rooted in some folklore, but it's not the folklore, right?
Oh, yeah, I agree. I think people sometimes don't look for sources.
Hmm.
And oftentimes I see because folklore has kind of is starting to become trendy in a way. I'm noticing that online. And a lot of the times you will see somebody even sharing pieces of folklore and just saying like, according to folklore, this and that.
Yeah.
But I always ask like, according to whose folklore, which folklore, where is it coming from? You need to know that because folklore is different, not only depending on a continent, obviously, but also depending on country, but within each country, depending on when. And it's so specific. So if we want to talk folklore, we always need to kind of go to the source, try to find out where is this coming from. And of course, it's evolving, but it came from somewhere. And it's nice to be able to honor that source, honor that root, and not just completely remove it, kind of whitewash it, and just label it folklore, but we don't really know whose folklore, right? So,
Right. Well, and I think it too depends on like at what point, who was it that gathered that folklore? If people are like, oh, well, I got it from Grimm brothers. Okay, but they were a very specific demographic and they gathered it from their perspective, like middle-aged white European male, right? And so that is sort of infused in it. And I think that if you understand that folklore is variable by region, by storyteller, and when you know it's fluid like that, I think that too many people are not aware of that it is so fluid. Especially, I agree that folklore is making a resurgence, as I think is like people practicing magic and people who are very interested in sort of occult things. And I was listening to a podcast not too long ago. I think it was one of the folklore podcasts episodes, and they were talking about how magic, like it sort of is cyclical. Like a lot of people will get interested in it, and then the next generation will be like, oh my God, my parents are into this weird stuff. And then they're not interested in it. And then a new generation comes and they're like, well, what about all these older traditions? And, but we do see far too many people telling other people the right and wrong way to practice their magic, which is ridiculous, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's as you said earlier, you're going to give a foundation, but then people have to develop what they're going to do with that based on who they are in the moment. And you're going to be a different person than you are today, 10 years from now. So maybe your magic evolves in that way too, and where you are and who you're practicing with, or if you're on your own. I mean, all of those things impact how you're going to make choices about what kind of magic that you want in your life.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk. You said that you teach people in diaspora. What do you teach people locally as well, or do you just focus on people that are away from Poland?
You know what? There's people from across the globe at this point learning with me. So I wouldn't say it's just people of the diaspora. I do have a lot of Polish people in my community as well, living in Poland and across Europe as well. So at this point, I feel like my platform has become so much more than what it originally was created to be.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's very broad at this point.
So what kind of classes do you teach?
You know what? All sorts, honestly. I am very passionate about teaching people that, first of all, like folklore is something more than just, a collection of cool legends and beliefs. To me, folklore is the oral tradition and knowledge of my people. It's very important to me. And that I really want to put it across that folklore is the living story of the ecology around us, that it springs directly from the land, from the landscape. So what I do is I teach people about obviously Polish folklore,
Mhm.
which I translate myself into English directly from local sources, just to make sure that it's properly sourced.
Right.
And always with bibliography, it's very important to me that people can trace back, that it's not just something that I speak about. So I especially love to dig in obscure ethnographic sources for traces of folk magic practices, like, for example, collecting old formulas and ritual practices, which I, of course, apply in my own practice as a folk witch. And then I teach those things to others as well. I love teaching about the folklore of various spirits. So, for example, I have classes about folkloric devils and land spirits and so on, the folklore of plant allies and their role in historic folk medicine and magic, the folklore of animals and their relationship with humans, the folklore of seasonal and agrarian traditions. I have an entire series of articles about many of these things. And of course, witch lore, as that's my tiny fixation that I have. I really love reading about Polish witch trials and, those really interesting kind of bits and bobs of witch lore that pops up across Poland. The stories of Polish witches, what kind of ointments they did, the kind of formulas they used. I teach all of that to people. There's so much more. I've been at it for 5 years, and there's over 400 pieces of content at this point that I have readily available, classes, articles, everything. There's so much. So at this point, I think anything you might want to know about Polish folklore, and folk magic, of course, I probably covered it already.
That's fantastic. So, when you're talking about Polish folklore, what do you think what are some of the things that you'll find in Polish folklore that you won't find elsewhere?
hmm I think it's important to stress first that Slavic and Polish folklore have Proto-Indo-European roots,
Mhm.
just like many other European countries and regions. So there will always be some similarities across Europe. But every folklore is shaped by the local landscape, as well as, of course, the culture, the language, the history of the people. So when it comes to the differences, I think the Slavic lore in general, in itself, is kind of distinct from Western European lore. I think we have, and it's kind of dependent on those both kind of religious aspects of the history of Europe, and basically the West being mostly Protestant at the most kind of formative years, whereas Poland, for example, has been Catholic, and other Slavic countries have been Orthodox and so on. So that alone kind of made an impact on what folklore was preserved, what folklore wasn't preserved, and so on. So within the Slavs, we have different folklore within West, East, and South Slavs. Each of those groups has a tiny bit of a different, I suppose, access or entry points into what ultimately created the folklore that's still preserved today. And even regions within Poland, especially landscape folklore, because that's a big thing, that the folklore here is very much rooted north, the rivers, the mines, the lakes, the forests. Each one of those areas will have different folklore of the spirits that reside there and the kind of legends of the spirit activity, what people need to look out for, right? Which spirits or maybe plant allies people should address for specific kinds of aid, what medicinal plants are used for specific ailments. Even the formulas, the magical formulas that are used will be very different depending on region. Like, for example, the Highlanders of the mountains have their own specific formulas. Then the Kashubians in the north of Poland, they have their own, dialect or language, and so on. It's very difficult to pinpoint like the lore that would be completely different, but it's just the kind of local variants of everything that ultimately shaped our folklore. And also, a lot of the times people access folklore through like first having background in paganism, for example, and being very interested in pantheons, the deities, and all of that. For example, in Poland, a lot pushes us to think that we never really had fully developed polytheism. It appears that, for example, our ancestors were much more focused on the cult of the dead or the cult of local land spirits. And some of them were kind of elevated above others to become kind of proto-deities, if that makes sense. So that's definitely different compared to Western Europe, where you have very robust polytheist, I guess, history, right?
Right, right.
So much more, obviously, but
It's very fascinating. So you talked a little bit earlier, we were talking about how folklore is tied to the land. Where do you think that folk magic and sort of the agrarian farming traditions, where do you think that intersects? Because I'm always fascinated about the folklore that we create, because we always create folklore based on stuff that's important to us, right? It's going to be about food. We're going to have good luck charms to be prosperous so we can survive. And so the things that are important to us are where our folklore grows. So I'd be fascinated in Polish folklore where those two things intersect.
I think folk magic is very much centered around agrarian traditions here because the majority ancestors, at least from peasantry, have been obviously farmers, and for hundreds of years they existed under pańszczyzna, which was a type of serfdom. So all they could do really was be farmers and exist very close to the land as a group of people that was very underprivileged and I would even say exploited by the people in power, by the nobility and so on. Like they had no other resources sometimes than to turn to folk magic for aid when it comes to survival, like having access to food, making sure that your, animals don't die, making sure that you are minimizing natural disasters and so on. So spells and rituals have been performed to ensure that of growth of plants and the harvest of plants, or also honoring the spirits or demons that were living in the fields, for example, was very important to ensure that you don't anger them. Otherwise, you're
Right,
probably not going to see those crops, right? Again.
right.
So there's just so much that goes into it. I feel like because our ancestors were, the majority of them were farmers, the majority of folk magic as a result is centered around the agrarian traditions and just ensuring that you actually have enough to survive.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty common worldwide, because obviously, that's what's important. You need to survive the winter. You need to put your stores aside. And if something goes wrong, if you don't get enough rain and your crops are poor, you die, right? And
Yep.
we're very much removed from that now in modern life, especially with big, massive farming endeavors where it's all kind of concentrated and a lot of it is not the farmer working their land, but it's an industrial complex of growing and developing food. I think that we see that. We also see folk traditions around the house because you need to stay warm. You need to, have protection from the animals that would, the predators out there that would kill you. So I think that that's pretty common worldwide. I think that you see other stuff in non-Western, like other kinds of folklore in non-Western, but we have creation stories, and then we have good luck stuff that we do, and we ward off evil, and we worship and try and make sure that we get food and that we're safe. So I think that you're right that it's rooted in our ancestors because our ancestors were farmers. Like when you get back to it, surely there were hunter-gatherer tribes that lived on when farming became more important. But for the most part, we started to grow our own food and not gather it anymore. And so, yeah, that's where it's going to focus. So that's fascinating. So you said earlier that you're an animist. Can you share what that belief system means to you and how your animism relates to folklore?
So animism is very important to me. It's a way of life that's integrated into every aspect of what I do, really. And so it naturally seeps into the folk magic that I do and the folklore traditions that are important to me. And I believe that folk traditions themselves are ultimately stemming from animism, and that animism survived the monotheist conversions across Europe and across the globe, really, through folklore. So, in my humble opinion, when we perceive folklore through an animist lens, that is like a key to understanding the folklore and where it came from. And without animism, folklore kind of just seems like a bunch of hillbilly stories, which is very ignorant and very disrespectful towards our ancestors and their wisdom. It just doesn't work these days. We favor our own perspective and perceive humans as the most effective that is really needed, this animist perspective that is needed to understand folklore, because our ancestors perceived everything around them as animate. They recognized the personhood of plants, of animals, of land features, even illnesses. They addressed them as beings, right? Which is very present in the zamawianie spoken formulas that we do for healing those illnesses. I think animism is the foundation that is needed for the practice of folk magic. Without it, we might not fully understand the technology behind the formulas and how things were done in folk magic. So I think the two things are very much inseparable in a lot of ways, and which is why in my life, animism plays the central role and it dictates how I live my life, how I conduct myself in the world, how I make sure to be always in right relations with the humans and non-human persons around me at all times. I think that's just the root of what is needed to be able to function, especially as a folk practitioner. So yeah, it's very important to me.
Right, and I think it's important. It goes back to what you were saying about really understanding the source material, because let's be honest, all magic, all folklore, everything we do is made up at some point, right? There was a time before humans, so there was a time where those belief systems didn't exist, and that's totally fine. But to understand sort of the socioeconomic realities of the people that were creating some of these traditions helps you be a better practitioner in my mind. And I'm an animist too. And I think that I don't know that I'd be able to practice really if I weren't, because how do you believe that your magic is making an effect on the world around you, if you don't believe that we can share energy with other creatures and the earth itself. And like, it's so rooted in believing that we are connected to all, life and matter on this earth. I don't understand how people practice magic without that sort of belief, because you'd be so skeptical at that point. How would you ever be effective at anything that you try, right?
Oh, yeah, I agree. And as a psychologist, I also do have a background in practicing, back when in the past, in the more psychological paradigm, which recognizes magic working on a more like archetypal level. I think that's helpful in a very limited way for as long as the magic you do only concerns you and is about internal stuff. So internal transformation, overcoming something, growing as a person, right? That
Right.
kind of makes sense. But as soon as you are trying to go beyond that,
Hmm.
it no longer works because that just doesn't apply to the world around you. And I believe that, you know, we are kind of, as a humankind, are kind of ignorant in what communication really is, because we assume that if somebody, something, if a rock doesn't speak my human language, then it's dead and I can't commune with it. We couldn't be further from the truth in that. You go outside and you interact with living persons all around you. It's just a matter of respecting them as equal to yourself. Suddenly the world opens up very much, and it doesn't seem so weird and so occult and so esoteric or paranormal to be speaking to spirits, as long as you are having even a bodily contact with, let's say, a tree or another plant. You are communing with it in a way. If you are interacting with a river or a lake, with your body, you are communing and communicating with it, and you want to ensure that they live in the same kind of well-being that you do, because you are in the interdependent. If I don't have the air to breathe and the water to drink, I am not going to be alive. So they are just as important to me, and I perceive them as allies because that's the right thing to do, I think. And especially in today's kind of climate crisis situation, we talk a lot about this, that a lot of folklore is rooted in those agrarian traditions, and people might not relate as much anymore because we are not farmers, right? But I
Right.
think we should be looking at this from a different perspective of, let's say, the climate crisis. Instead of doing folk magic for like making sure that your wheat grows, if you don't grow wheat, like obviously that doesn't concern you, but you might want to do weather magic to ensure that, the climate crisis doesn't wreck your home or stuff like that. We just need to kind of reframe the context to modern context, but it's still the same stuff. We still live in the same world. Nothing's changed. We kind of just forgot about certain aspects of that, which is why I believe, learning about those ancestral traditions is just so, so, so important, so that we can root ourselves in the full context of the world that we live in and not just the human context of it.
And we're all so much more interconnected than we think. A couple weeks ago, there was very, very poor air quality, and there was a dust storm that came through, which is first time in my life, and I've lived here a very long time. And it just like sort of blew up from some of the land that was west of here that is desert. And then we also had the added problem of there were wildfires in Canada, and the smoke was coming down here. And it was so strange because the sun was out and it was like, brightly shining, but it looked muted. And those were like both from places that would take hours and hours and hours, like a better part of a day to drive to. And so very far from where I live. And yet, we were definitely affected here very strongly. I think that you're right about respecting the land and that we are having obviously climate crisis. So when you start to think about plant allies and you think about that, and yes, they are as meaningful and important as I am, then you start to have a different relationship with everything around you. And so I think that as a folklorist, it doesn't matter to me whether or not the stories are true. What's important is, why do people believe these stories? Why do they tell them? Why do they believe these practices? Why are these superstitions in place? But like as a practitioner, it's like, of course, it's the basis of everything, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And the funny thing is that with the smoke from Canada, it even came over Poland recently. So we are so much more interconnected than we think, as you were saying.
Right. And we're sort of taught in our school systems here, at least, we're taught that we are like independent units. And it's almost like a gear in the machines, that it doesn't work that way. We're not like standalone. We all need each other to function. You know, your contribution is just as important as the person who is, I don't know, growing our food. And so, you know, the keeper of stories, as you are, it's one of our more important functions. And we downplay artists and the teller of tales, and we act like that's not a serious undertaking, where in my opinion it's the most serious undertaking, because that's our stories are what define us.
Oh, yes. And where would we be rooted and what would we flock to if we didn't have those stories that could help us root ourselves and identify ourselves? But also, what you said about us being taught that we are, each of us, an individual and all of that. I believe that it's a cultural change very much rooted in late stage capitalism at this point, right? Because you need to be isolated to feel like you need to get all that stuff to be able to survive, and not look for that in community, in co-creating, in sharing, in actually being in something together, because there's a lot of
Mhm.
strength in being together, in togetherness. And I think that there's a
Yes.
lot of relief that comes from decentering myself as an individual in favor
Mm.
of this collective connection with other humans and with the ecology around me. I feel a lot of relief when I think that I'm no more important than the tree in my yard, and also makes me care more about that tree and makes me care more about the air that it produces and the way it interacts with the soil and the fruit that it creates for the birds and so on. So it's all part of one big thing that we are together in. And it's nice to be able to recognize that. You feel so much less alone and so much less scared of what the current situation in the world is creating for us, right? I think we really need it in today's times.
I agree, absolutely. And I love that you describe it as a relief, because I hadn't really thought about it that way, but it's true. We're like, oh, be independent, and you like nobody's coming to help you, and you've got to, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's like, well, what if I don't have any boots, right? And so there is a relief knowing that we are just part of a bigger thing. And I think that when you start to live your life as part of something bigger than yourself, you do become less selfish and you do become more connected to that. So that's a really great perspective. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's talk about how people can find your work if they want to learn more.
Sure. You can find me everywhere online as Polish Folk Witch, but especially if you are interested in learning from me, make sure to check out my Patreon, where, as I was mentioning, I have over 400 pieces of educational content about folklore, animism, folk magic, and folkloric traditional witchcraft as well. We have a very welcoming community of people where we do stuff together, and there's so many people with from the diaspora, for example, sharing experience that they have with learning the traditions along, in a group. It's very nice and welcoming. So I welcome everybody to check it out.
That's great. And I will have the links in the show notes. So if you're listening and you do want to find Joanna, you can go to those show notes and you'll see those links. So, do you have any final thoughts for listeners before we say goodbye?
I think a lot of the thoughts that come to mind recently with the global situation, especially, we talked about that, about the importance of interconnectedness and about the importance of community. I just always want to encourage people to seek community no matter what. No matter the situation you are in, you are never alone. There are always people who are humans and non-human persons as well who are out there, especially your ancestors. They always, always have your back. So always seek community. That's the thought I would like to part with.
Oh my God, that's so folkloring. I love that. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today. This was a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate all of your thoughts and spending the time sharing with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
As always, thank you for listening to Folkloring. If you have any questions or comments or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Blue Sky, Facebook, or Instagram. Other places you can find me are at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent, or creating folklore-inspired games at madmenandheroes.com. Stay curious, stay connected, and keep the traditions alive. And I hope that wherever you are, folklore is making your life more magical.